thanks to the wonderful people of Harvey Norman. It is here in this beautiful part of North Queensland, Townsville, where I can tell you the humidity, it's 600% and has been for the past couple of weeks. Now, it's cooled down to a mere 88% humidity, but we have had a magnificent weekend from the All-Stars that we'll show you in a couple of minutes' time all the way through to some great experiences. But, of course, the whole point of being here is to celebrate regional Australia. Again, thanks to the good people of Harvey Norman, we're able to do that for you yet again for now our 6th year on the road around the country, and it's good to be in the parts of the country that most of the media, well, they just point out at the map when it comes to the weather. We're here and in the front line. And as I said, Friday night was a huge experience for everyone in Townsville, which of course was the Indigenous All-Stars. The Indigenous All-Stars versus the Maoris at the stadium. It's a couple of years old, but it still feels brand new. It was a great experience for us to be there a little bit earlier. In fact, this was part of our experience this weekend. I can explain that if you were looking for top-flight athleticism, it was at the All-Stars. That was me mucking around on a jet ski. You'll also, in a couple of minutes, see us mucking around with a croc that was looking at the fat bloke you are watching on telly right now and going, the buffet is open. Have a look. Go.
Wow! That is so cool! Oh, that is so amazing.
Now you got the hang of it. You got this for sure now there, Brent.
Wow.
My voice goes really high when I'm being really masculine in front of a crocodile. But there I was. All right, before we get to all of that, as you know, I like to have my say on the day's news, and how can we not talk about the past couple of days when the illegal boat arrivals have again begun. Now, we learn that there's been about a dozen or so boat arrivals since the greatest Prime Minister was elected in May of 2022. But the most recent examples, well, they landed both on Friday and again on Saturday. Big problems for a government that, of course, in the Parliament has spent the week talking about how they were big on borders and big on national security. Oh, here's some people floating in from Pakistan. Here's some people floating in again, paying the people smugglers. But I've got to say, while I know it's serious, what about the on-top-of-it, details-focused Prime Minister? You know, the guy who kind of told us while he was applying for the job he's not a details guy. Remember when, oh, look, I don't know what the unemployment rate is, I'm just here to be the lipstick on the lefty pig. Well, he proved that because the first time he learnt about it wasn't from the Home Affairs Minister, it wasn't from some admiral in Western Australia. He was learning about it from a reporter asking him a question, and he had no idea. I don't know if this makes you feel safe if China ever invaded, but have a look.
Prime Minister, we're hearing that an asylum seeker boat has arrived off to the Western Australian coastline. Do you know anything about that?
I've been travelling in the car, so I'm not. I haven't been advised about that.
OK, this concerns me. He's the Prime Minister in 2024 who thinks that he's driving a truck in 1984 where they haven't come up with the Motorola mobile phone yet and the old 018 number, where, you know, there was a couple of fancy pants people who had a mobile phone. But I'm pretty sure a quarter of the way into the 21st century, our Prime Minister might have one of these magical devices, these special security devices that mean someone from anywhere in the world can ring you to say, PM, not one but 2 boat arrivals. For his part, Peter Dutton, who of course, along with Scott Morrison, along with the late great Jim Molan, they put Operation Sovereign Borders in place. They know how this works. So when they say there's holes in the operation, you know it's Swiss cheese. Roll a tape.
I think there are very significant issues when the Prime Minister of our country is not even aware, hasn't received any briefing, doesn't have the protections put in place with surveillance mechanisms, etc., to pick up a boat that arrives on our shores. It demonstrates that this government has lost control of our borders.
Now, I'm not going to join the conga line of saying, that's it, the borders are open again. Look, it has been a couple. It has been 12 in their time in office. Let's see what next week and the week after provide. But As always on this show, I like to show you the data, show the evidence, not just the bluster, also show you the stuff behind it, including the Prime Minister tries to present himself as Mr. Operation Sovereign Borders. There is no difference between this government and the last government, apart from the fact that my phone doesn't work. OK. But interestingly, maybe Toto should have to bark him important information. I don't know. Just ideas we're having for you in Townsville tonight. Now, he's out there basically saying no difference between the old and the new. Roll the tape.
That Operation Sovereign Borders remains in place. We are implementing the policies that we said we would before the election, and this is just the latest demonstration of it.
Small problem. Operation Sovereign Borders has three parts to it: turnbacks, temporary protection visas, and offshore detention. As you know, when it came to turn back the boats, the current bloke who's in charge of it, ultimately that being the Prime Minister, well, less than 10 years ago, he was arguing with his then leader, Bill Shorten, about whether the policy should be to turn back boats. Now, I get it, politicians say one thing, do another, but when somebody's willing to argue, as he did 10 years ago, against a policy that has saved lives, then you know what side his heart is on in all of this. In fact, because my mobile phone works and I can Google it, we found what he said in 2015.
And when we talk about boats, of course, we're talking about people on boats. I'm of the view that I would just find it... I couldn't ask someone else to do something that I couldn't see myself doing. And if people were in a boat, including families and children, I myself couldn't turn that around. I would want to make sure that they were safe and secure. That was a position that I came to. I respect people on the other side of the debate who came to a different position.
So now the guy who was telling us, you know, my word is my bond, was saying within 10 years that something as fundamental as, do you oppose what has been proven to work? Because remember, for 2013, 2014, 2015, it was proven to work. But because he was still holding on to the lefty ideals of the man who was running against Bill Shorten to be leader, but didn't assume he would be anytime soon, he could still be what he is at his heart, which is the hardcore lefty who doesn't want to do the tough and difficult and ugly, if you will, stuff around turning a boat back and sending it that way. But also, as I mentioned, the three pillars of this thing: offshore detention, and we know that the people inside the government have been leaking very aggressively to the media about the problems with offshore detention and which company got this contract and all the rest of it. All of that is about undermining offshore detention. Then there is, of course, turn back, which they say is their policy, presumably has happened, but the PM's heart's not really in it. And then there's the third part, which, as I say, is about temporary protection visas. This is the ultimate sugar on the table. Now, the Prime Minister says this about the system that we have today.
Our position on Operation Sovereign Borders is very clear, and that people who attempt to arrive here by boat will not settle here.
But remember, of course, between 2007, 2013, 50,000 people came here on boats. The ones that were legitimate, well, they found their way into the community. The ones who had no path, well, they sat in detention until eventually they left. But then there was a group of 19,000 people. 19,000 people who were not refugees. They lost their appeals to be refugees. They lost their appeal for the appeal for the appeal for the appeal to be refugees. But by removing the temporary protection visa, 19,000 people, all in one day in December in their first 6 months of government, essentially were given the full protection of Australian citizenship. And while the Prime Minister wants to pretend that the same system existed, that has existed for the past 10 years or so, it's not true. And not just because the odd boat bobs in or out, but because the removal of the temporary protection visa system and their failure to deal with the High Court decision about indefinite detention means that eventually, if you wait it out, you will get to be a citizen of Australia. You will be able to, thanks to the advocates or the sob stories that will be in the media, you will eventually make it into the community. And while Australians in and of themselves are not heartless human beings who believe that somebody who's coming from some horrible part of the world should have to stay in that horrible part of the world because, well, too bad. We believe in a system where there's a front door. Remember when Trump talked about his wall, but it'd have a really little tiny front door in it? Well, ours is a big front door. Football stadiums of people every single year Australia welcomes to the country from refugee camps around the world. We have a front door system to mean that people are able to be saved from hellholes around the world. But when somebody turns up on our shores, waits it out in detention, and takes 19,000 places that would otherwise be for the people who were refugees, who came through the front door, well, the system doesn't work. Now, we have the natural advantage of being a giant island, but the difference between being a giant island of which people smugglers in Indonesia do the sums on which bit of the coast they're going to launch because they think no one will be there, and a country that says regardless of whether you land offshore here in Townsville or whether you land in the sandiest part north of Broome in Western Australia, if we find you, we'll make sure you get a glass of water and then you're going to go to the back of the queue. Any break in that resolution means that people will tough it out. Now, also, if you're coming from a country like Pakistan or Sri Lanka, these are not countries that are next door to us. Again, the advantage of being an island. You see, to be a refugee, according to the lefties at the United Nations, whatever bad country you're in, you have to go to the nearest, safest country. And there's quite a few between here and Pakistan. But when people are making their way to this country from places like Pakistan, they are not doing it for safety. They are doing it for the sugar that's on the table that this government put on the table. That says, if you wait it out, you will eventually find a way in. And that's not a system that anyone voted for at the last election. But as this government shows us time and time and time again, it doesn't matter what you voted for, you're going to get the lefty policies that they promised they definitely wouldn't put in place. And just finally on this too, who do you trust with our national security? Do you trust Andrew Giles, the immigration minister, or clueless Claire O'Neill? I wouldn't think so. Or what about Peter Dutton? Is he the one that you think, if he was the Prime Minister, that he would be having any half-assed attitude about what boats get turned around or not? We will see what happens. But the Prime Minister has always been bad on boats. And in my view, always will be. Now, another thing that certainly matters here in North Queensland is what car you get to drive. Now, old Cassanova Bowen, and in case you don't know what that means, Cassanova would be someone who everything they touch, they form a relationship with. Let me put it that way. Now, as you know, he introduced fuel efficiency standards, which suggest that from 2028, if you carry the one and you buy the right type of car, you might be able to save some money. But apparently, this new push towards EVs, well, it won't affect what cars you get to buy.
No model will be mandatory, no model will be banned.
Only problem is, what they're doing is they're going to introduce a cap. And they're going to say to anyone who wants to sell cars in Australia that you're only allowed this much in terms of the emissions. So, of course, if you sell bigger cars, bigger emissions, which means you're going to be able to sell fewer cars. Or in the case of some brands, no cars at all. And while I don't have a problem with EVs, if you want to putt them around the city, good luck to you. But the idea that people who are tradies or people who want to cover the big distances that people do in places like Townsville, well, there's going to be a problem. National Senator Matt Canavan actually looked through the detail here and explains why the new cars that lots of people drive in a place like Townsville are either going to be too expensive or will not be for sale, according to this. Follow the bouncing ball. The most popular car sold in Australia last year was the Ford Ranger. According to the government's figures, it produces 182 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre driven. In 2029, the government's emissions limit for light commercial vehicles, such as the Ford Ranger, will be 81 grams of carbon dioxide. So today's Ford Ranger would be 101 grams over the limit, and at a tax of $100 per gram, the Ford will get an extra $10,000 on a price should you choose to buy it. Also, things like the Toyota Hilux, have a look. That would end up having an extra $13,000 on top of it. What about a Ford Ute? That could end up with an extra $6,000 on it. What about a Land Cruiser? Well, again, you could end up in a scenario there of almost $13,000 on top of what is the current price to buy a car. Maybe if you want to buy something like a Hyundai i30, that'll cost you an extra, again, $7,000. It goes on and on. A Triton, $8,600. And if you think, oh, well, OK, what about just a family SUV? If you want to get a Kia Sportage, that will cost you, thanks to Chris Bowen, an extra $4,810. Townsville, do you want Chris Bowen to decide what car you can drive? No! What message would you like to send him in a non-sweary fashion? I agree, they can't come up with the word either. But on the behalf of the people in Townsville and the people who want to drive whatever the hell they want to drive, Bowen, go away, please. But there's a chance that that actually may happen, because another little story that's around this weekend is that a bunch of local mayors are getting ready to pull off what Di Lee was able to pull off when she killed off Christina Keneally at the last election. And I know how sad you were about all of that. Well, local mayors are planning to run, including people running against Chris Bowen. So there's a chance Chris Bowen gets flushed by the local mayor.